Welcome to Holding Down the Fort, a podcast show dedicated to curating knowledge, resources, and relevant stories for today's military spouses so they can continue to make confident and informed decisions for themselves and their families. Because let's face it, we know who's really holding down the fort. I'm Jen Amos, a Gold Star daughter, veteran spouse, and your host for Holding Down the Fort by U.S. Vet Wealth. Let's get started. All right, hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Holding Down the Fort Season 3. And this is a special episode because although the show has already started, I wanted to backtrack and actually reintroduce you all to my co-host here, Jenny Lynne Stroup. So Jenny Lynne, welcome to the show.
Thanks, happy to be here.
Yeah, and although we've already sort of introduced yourself, I thought we would just dedicate one episode to you to really have you share your story and talk about why you decided to be on the show. Well, first of all, let me just start by saying thank you for choosing to reach out to me. I know in a newsletter some time ago now, this is like literally months ago now, I think at the start of the pandemic, really, when I kind of knew that I wanted to have a co-host on the show to just bounce ideas off of and add a different perspective. And you were definitely one of the first people to do that. And I appreciated you just kind of being very open and willing to just showing up, because to me, that's all I really needed, to have someone to show up and add to the conversation, and everything else is taken care of. So, and you get to enjoy wonderful conversations with people. So I'm appreciative for you joining me. I am curious to know, and to our listeners that are hearing about you for the first time, what compelled you to reach out and say, yes, I'm going to co-host with you, Jen?
Oh man, part of it was total whim. I'm one of those people like, well, that sounds fun. Let me give it a shot. So I did. But I mean, the truth is, I really enjoyed being a guest. I think I was a guest with my clinic director, I don't know, a month or so before you sent out the newsletter looking for a co-host. And you just made us feel like so warm and welcome. And it was fun to talk to you that I was like, I like to talk to people and hear fun stories. And as a military spouse and, you know, a military family, like the mission of this podcast to get good resources to military families is one that I can really get behind. So it's fun for me to get to see, quote unquote, other people in my sphere and learn from them and know what's out there.
I appreciate you saying that. And I don't know if the stats are constantly changing, and you can correct me on this, but I know that only really less than 1% of the American community actually serves. And so we are really a tiny, tiny community. There's a lot of us if you find us in the bases and everything, but we're really tiny and we have a very unique experience compared to our civilian counterparts. And so part of why I decided to do Holding Down the Fort, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is really to humanize our story, to know that it's not just the service member that's serving, it's the family. You know, it's a spouse, it's the kids. They're serving just as much and dealing with so many different issues that is, again, so unique and different from our civilian counterparts.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the most recent I looked at, I think was from the Blue Star Families, like 2018 or 19 survey, and it's 0.5%. So less than 1% is active duty serving, which makes me a military spouse 0.25%. So 1/4% of people are active duty spouses. And when I read that and said it to someone else also in the military community out loud, he was like, wait, say that again? And I was like, yes, 1/4% is who I represent. And yeah, when you're kind of in this world, it does feel like we're a lot bigger than we are. Mm-hmm. But when you realize that it feels that way, I mean, I live in San Diego. And so I have friends here who have lived in San Diego their whole lives. And it is just second nature to them to have military friends because we're all here, because this is a huge area where the military is. But think of some like little teeny town in like Iowa. Do you know how many people they have that are military there? Not many. And to think of that like nationwide, like we're less than 1/4% of people as spouses and families. It's pretty interesting. And I think it's great that you're helping get our stories out there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, it is interesting because, you know, you and I have essentially swapped places. I lived in San Diego for 20 years. And just like what you said, it just felt so normal to be around military affiliated people, or someone knew someone, that was at least in the military. And I come from a military background as well. And it's part of how, my parents were able to leave the Philippines, is my dad and his brother joined the military and were able to serve. And I was essentially born as an American, but on American soil, like in Japan. And so I feel like I was already like birthed into a very, interesting culture, because people ask me often, do you speak Japanese? I was like, no, I was in the American base. Okay. Like, yes, I would step out every now and then, but it doesn't mean that I could speak it fluently, nor am I Japanese. But, it's interesting to know that there's a small percentage of us that serve and the families that support those who serve. And yeah, I just find it so fascinating. And I think like right now, especially with the pandemic, I feel like a lot of our civilian counterparts can really learn from our military families and what it means to, have your spouse gone for a long time and then suddenly everyone's in the house, and it's just like, what are you doing here? You're ruining my routine, and just learning to make that adjustment. And I think that if our civilian counterparts can, learn from us and see that, hey, like adapting is part of our life. It's part of our culture, being resilient, being resourceful. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if I grew amongst my civilian counterparts. And I think like, I'm so glad that I was raised in this life, because it's taught me to be nimble and optimistic and resourceful in everything that I believe we know at this point that military families have to go through. And I think it's part of why I'm able to, be the entrepreneur I am and be able to kind of have the lifestyle that I have, is because of that background. It's not to say though that it obviously comes with its challenges, having to uproot yourself quite often. And so I know for you, Jenny Lynne, you came from Virginia Beach or Virginia. So we essentially swapped places. And if you can, a little briefly, share a little bit about your life before you and your family entered the military, and how was that transition for you to adjust as a military spouse?
Yeah, so a couple things came to mind as you were talking. One, as a military spouse, I'm not a former veteran, so I've never been active duty or reserve or anything. I straddle that gap between civilian and military community, because technically I am a civilian. Mm-hmm. And also the military affects a big part of my life. And I grew up in Hampton Roads, mm-hmm. which when I grew up there, where I lived in Suffolk, which is about 30 to 45 minutes away from Virginia Beach and Norfolk, depending on how fast you drive, not many military families lived out that far. It was just too far of a commute. And so I did not grow up around more than probably one or two people that were military. And so for me, the Navy, especially being from Hampton Roads, was just always kind of that thing that was over there. Like we knew that it was there, and there was kind of, for me, this inherent like safety, but it never affected me. I never had a reason to really think of anything other than, oh, there's some boats over there in Norfolk. Like that was really start and finish of my military history prior to meeting and marrying my husband. And really for my whole family. I mean, my uncle and my grandfather both served, but my grandfather served before my dad was born, so he didn't grow up a military kid. My uncle is much younger than my dad, and so he served, but he was always like the fun younger uncle, that we would see every now and again and all that. But again, it wasn't a military lifestyle. Like we didn't, my family was, went to work 9 to 5, like that. So in marrying my husband, it really kind of pushed my whole immediate family into this like weird world of deployments and workups and trainings and all of these things that none of us had ever really experienced. And for a while, Matthew did several trainings and deployments and transferred from enlisted to officer. He went to officer candidate school. And we as in me and our children, stayed in Hampton Roads. I mean, he was kind of all over the place, but we stayed where I grew up. And so largely we lived a civilian lifestyle with this military kind of overhang, I was still friends with all the people I grew up with. I still went to the grocery store I'd always gone to. I still lived in the same town and saw the same people. And it was just that my husband was in uniform and often not there. In fact, most of the time not there. And when he returned from his second deployment, we moved for the first time as a as a military family. And we moved to a largely civilian area. So our not our second duty station, we kind of bounced around within Hampton Roads for a bit, but our first time like leaving the Hampton Roads area, we moved to Manhattan, New York City. And so, Matthew was one of two active duty Navy people in the office. That's right, one of two. And so we were the only Navy family. Neither of his bosses were married with kids. So we were the only Navy family. And we lived in one of the commuter towns to New York. And we were, for some people, the only military people they'd ever met. So, when I think about that being the 0.25%, like it was never more prevalent than when we lived up there. And I am very grateful that I had a community that was curious and, wanted to know. I got lots of questions like, so we hear you're rich because the government pays, for these and this thing. And, It was one of those things that after having years of friendship with these people, like I was kind of like, what myths did we debunk for you? And they were like, well, we learned
that you're not rich.
You're not rich. That the Navy controls a lot more of your life than we would have ever assumed, that we have, and so I think that's when I really kind of embraced the military spouse lifestyle is like, oh, it is different and it's good. And I really do want to be that gap straddler between the military and the civilian community, because I saw what a difference it made in my civilian community for, people to see what it's like up close for people to live a military lifestyle. Now, let me caveat that with saying New York is very different than regular Navy life. We were in a position, Matthew's in a position of like outreach, really. And so we did a lot of fun and pretty. And so like, it wasn't deployments, it wasn't, trainings and stuff. It was put on your best uniform, go make the Navy look good and have fun while you're doing it. So even at that, like our friends saw this, mess dress and ball gowns and all, and they were like, wow, this is great. And I'm like, but this really isn't it either. But it opened the door to conversations about what it had been like before and what it was going to be like after that tour. And so moving then to San Diego was a little shock to the system, because all of a sudden we were back in an area where like every third house is Navy, even if you don't live on base, which we don't, and so there's a little more inherent understanding of military lifestyle. And then also that civilian mindset of, well, of course, everybody knows people like you. You're all here. We're like, yeah, but we're not all everywhere. So that's kind of how I got to where I am. And, it was really that New York tour that kind of solidified for me both what's really special and what's really hard and what's really interesting about being a military family and military spouse.
Yeah, I think that once you get adjusted to the life, I don't think we'll ever get adjusted, but when you get a sense of adjustment, it becomes a form of responsibility to educate people about it, So one of my pet peeves growing up was every time people knew I was, part of a military family, they called me a military brat. And I think that's cute and all. And it's like, yeah, sure, we get the benefits and, whatever. But to me, as a Gold Star daughter too, that came with a lot of pain. And I took that offensively. I was like, I'm not a brat. Like I lost my dad to the service. Yes, my school was paid for, thank God I didn't have to worry about like college debt and stuff like that. And I had all the health benefits and, just the benefits that you would get as a kid. I think I lost it all around 21 or 23. I forgot which one, but I remember when my mom sort of hinted that like, hey, you're not going to have this anymore. I'm like, oh, so that's the bubble I lived in. But either way, just carrying that pain. And it actually took until like later on in my life, my young adult life, when I really started to see my military child conditioning play out, because it was really hard for me to hold down a job. Like, even though I got a bachelor's, I actually got fired from 4 jobs consecutively in my young 20s. Like, I couldn't hold down a job because I think like every 2 to 3 years, I'd be like, this feels very unsettling. Like, am I supposed to stay here? Or I just always had this desire to take off, or to do something different or to have multiple projects at once. And so to me, when people call me a military brat, it's like, I mean, not that anyone's called me that lately. I think military brat typically goes toward maybe the youth or teens nowadays. But, when I do hear that term, I really challenge people to look deeper than that and be like, yeah, we have certain things, but it's at the cost of so many other things, And so I appreciate you saying that what you do as a spouse is you kind of straddle that gap between the civilian life and the military life. And that's why I'm really happy to have you on the show, Jenny Lynne, because I also know that you're a blogger and you love, talking about this life and kind of demystifying it, not just to give peace of mind or maybe comfort or connection with the military community, but even for the civilians who really haven't been around military people. I remember even in San Diego, I had a good friend who lived in northern San Diego, so probably not close to Pendleton, but I forgot exactly where she lived. But she pretty much lived in this bubble. She's an artist, a professional artist, and I was one of the first people that she really met where she knew that I was a Gold Star daughter, and she heard about like just my family and losing my dad. And she's all like, wow, like the military really have it hard. Like she had no idea, the sacrifices that could take place. Fortunately, most people don't have to go through that, but like just to know the sacrifice and what gets left behind, or even the impact of a service member's career onto the family. And so it was really interesting to like what felt normal for me to talk about with like everyone. I was like, yeah, I'm a Gold Star daughter. I lost my dad, was very like unusual for like the average person to be like, what? Like, I can't believe, that happened to you. I'm so sorry. Like they were very apologetic of it, even though for me it happened, 20 years ago now. But I think the point of what I'm trying to say is that this is why the show exists, is to let people know that there's a lot of sacrifice and responsibility and duty to be a military family. And it is very important for us to share our stories, not just to stay connected and to not feel alone, but also to educate our civilian counterparts that like, hey, you're welcome. You're welcome. Like this, like your taxpayer dollars, like is going to people like us so that, you can continue to feel safe and pursue your dreams and your goals and your, whatever you want to do. It's because of us. So you're welcome.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can tell you like pinpoint the moment that I realized like, oh man, like education about this lifestyle is really important to me. I probably should have realized it a little sooner. I do have a master's degree in elementary education and have taught school for several years. And so I should have put two and two together that education was really important to me. However, it took a while. But I participated in this event in New York City called Theater of War. And the premise of this is that actors come on and do a scene or two from a Greek tragedy that depicts like wartime behavior. And then after the scenes are over, a panel of people who are military affiliated, whether they be active duty, veteran, spouse, whomever, talk about their own experience with war based on like what the show was about. So we have to connect our experiences to the play in front of an audience. And then after the panelists share their experience, the moderator has very specific questions he asks the audience to kind of get their feedback, get their read, if this is totally new for them, like what kind of came to them while they were watching both the play and hearing the experiences. And it was a 2-night run, and I did both nights on the panel. And one of the evenings after I'd shared my version of what it, experienced with war, there was like a cocktail reception afterward. And this girl came up to me and she kind of like touched my arm and was like, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I was like, oh, you're welcome. Like, and she said, I just didn't have any idea there were people like you.
Wow.
Insert like awkward silence because I have nothing to say. And inside my head, I'm like, wait, what? Like, you didn't know that people that like went to war are married to people. You didn't know that there were families. Like, I'm not really sure what's happening. And, I was so shocked by her comment that I didn't say all of the things I wish I'd said. And like, now years later, I wish I would have had more of that education mindset of like, actually there, 0.25% of us around the US. But really, I mean, that really for me kind of set the pace for me and like not a goal per se, but just really kind of lit that fire of, it is important that people know. I mean, this was for an audience of largely civilian people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I would say out of the 100 people there, 90 of them were civilian,
Right.
And that's because like my husband was in the audience, so he is obviously military affiliated. Like,
right. You added him to the statistic. You're like, we probably like the 10.
Yeah. It's probably, yeah. But, we were talking to people that really didn't have any connection. And so one, I am so grateful that program exists, and Theater of War still does great work now, still doing that same program to really make that connection. But yeah, I mean, I can see it just as clearly now, like almost been like 5 years, 5 years after doing it as I could that night. And I do think it's really important. I think it's really important that those of us who live this lifestyle share, because it is hard, and it also is neat, and it also is fun. And I never imagined living in California. I mean, kind of like maybe when I was watching Saved by the Bell, thought it would be cool, but not like as I'm going to move to California and live there. It's just like this weird idea. And now I've been here for 4 years. So I'm like, oh, I've lived in California. Right. I've lived outside Manhattan. Like, who didn't want to do that when we watched Sex and the City in college? Like, everyone. Right. So it's provided a lot of experience. And then I think as a spouse and having children, I mean, one, it's given my children an incredible amount of resilience and learning to go with the flow and learning to be flexible. And it's brought its own scars and wounds. And also, especially because they were small when we lived in New York and got to do a lot of really fun things, it gave them this idea of the world that like being in the military was fun. Like they got to do a lot of things that had we stayed living, had I gotten married and stayed in my hometown, like we would have never done. I mean, I'm always struck by one of my first memories from being up in New York with them is that my parents came to visit our first Thanksgiving, and we'd been there about 4 or 5 months. And so we'd taken the boys into the city, and they'd kind of seen the big sights. And my parents came up at Thanksgiving, and we'd take them to Times Square. And my dad, who was in his 60s, is like standing there like a kid looking at all the lights because he'd never been to New York City. And my 3-year-old was like, Daddy, what are you doing? And he's like, I've just never been here. It's really neat. My 3-year-old's like, I'm 3. I've been here, and so there's a certain aspect of military life that like, I hope that when they're older, they get to look back on and go, man, when I was 3, I was in Times Square. Like when I was 7, we moved to San Diego and I got to see the Pacific Ocean, which I was in my 30s when I saw the Pacific Ocean when we moved here.
Right.
So I think talking about all of it, the good, the bad, the weird, the cool, is really helpful. And as a writer, I mean, stories are my jam. So
yeah, I appreciate you sharing all of that, Jenny Lynne. And again, it just affirms why I'm so glad, to have you as a co-host to add your perspective and be unapologetic about it, especially when you come to a place where you realize like what you thought was normal is actually very abnormal for a lot of people. And I think we can kind of, like I said earlier, like demystify, and I want to say de-romanticize. I don't know if that's a word, but like, stop romanticizing the military life. It's very common on Instagram, for example, where you see that standard photo of a service member coming home and the spouse, whether it's a girlfriend, fiance, or wife, is greeting them. And it's all about the reunion. It's all about that beautiful, exciting reunion. But there's a lot of pain that happens before that, all the waiting, the patience, like the, just kind of the questioning and asking yourself, like, is this worth it? Is it worth waiting for this person to come back? Or just that resilience of like, I'm going to wait for this person to come back and I'm going to keep myself busy. But then by the time they're back, it's like you already have this whole routine. So it's like just that little snapshot of, oh my gosh, they're back is really only a snapshot. There's so much that happens before and after that. And so I'm just glad to have a medium such as podcasting to really convey more to the story other than just that snapshot moment, which is so beautiful and it drives people to tears. I've definitely seen those, like even my husband has shown me those videos where the service member comes home to their dog, and the dog hasn't seen the service member forever. And the dog is just like freaking out. And it's like the cutest thing and you're crying and stuff like that. But again, that is only one aspect of this military life. There's so much that goes in it, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I'm just really glad to have this medium again to really amplify those stories and let people know it's not just a service member that's sacrificing for your freedom, but it's the family. So y'all welcome. And, thank us by listening to our stories and honoring us and having more conversations with us and not just calling us rich or military brats.
Yeah. When we talk about like sharing our stories and, what we do, I think the thank you is great. And what I would really stress is that it's often really awkward for military families. And it's awkward because, one, so many things are romanticized or villainized. I mean, there are very few shows on TV. There are two that I can think of that I watch that do it quite well. But most, it's either this like over dramatization of what it's like to be at war or to be someone who comes home from war and what that looks like, or it's over romanticized in the ain't it great he's home. Mm-hmm. And neither of those are totally true. Mm-hmm. And I think with, thanking us for our service, the best thank you, at least for me and my family, is like, be willing to learn about our story. I think that's one of the things that really in Connecticut with our friends, really, when they would say things like that, they could put a face and a name to what they were saying, and they knew the things our family had walked through versus a blanket, like awkward thank you on a subway, which happened often because Matthew was in uniform. And it's always this awkward, like, you're welcome. Whereas really we would, really it's like, thank you. And do you know what we do? Thank you. And do you actually want to know who we are? Like, and it's the and that's more important to me than the thank you. Like, because chances are you're not like me because I represent 0.25% of the population. Like, chances are you actually have no idea what you're thanking me for. You have no idea that my husband left when my first son was 3 months old for training and literally never came back. Like, I mean, for a weekend here or there, was not home when was on deployment when my second child was born and met him on the pier, then deployed again immediately after. And we moved 25 days after he came home from deployment. And you have none of that when you look at me standing next to him in uniform. And that actually is far more important to me than just the blanket thank you.
Yeah.
So I really hope that people listening who are military families, know how much of those of us that do this really do appreciate what you do. And for anyone listening to this that didn't know all of those things, before just rushing out a thank you, maybe actually take the time to get to know the people. And a better thank you is, can I cut your grass when your husband's gone? Right. Do you need a babysitter for your kids while you run to the grocery store? That for me is a much better way to appreciate a military family than just thanks for your service.
Yeah, it's almost like an empty apology in a way. It's all like, if you're going to apologize or if you're going to express gratitude, put some oomph behind it, add something to it. It's like, can I do anything for you? Can I help you? Tell me. And, my husband brought that up too, because as a veteran, he gets it all the time. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. And he's all like, can you get to know me? He's like, could you say anything else but thank you? Can you ask me, what if I just did paperwork? What if I just pushed paper in the military? What are you thanking me for? You have no idea, what I did. I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that this is a great way to create awareness about that and let people know that you could do more than say thank you. And with this show, we'll give you the tools, on how to do that. We will encourage you. We will challenge you to do that because remember, freedom isn't free. And part of that is thanks to our service members and our military families that support the service member. Wow. Well, Jenny Lynne, I think that's a great way to bring you on the show. But before we go, just really quick, let's just give a little snapshot of your life today, just so that yes, you are a co-host on the show, but I know that you do other things. And so let us know, for our listeners that want to get to know you, what are you up to nowadays?
Oh man, what am I not up to is probably the better question. Well, during the pandemic, I have onboarded as an outreach coordinator for a national military mental health network. So I advocate for military mental health, both for service members, veterans, and families. That is super important to me as a military family. I'm also the mom of 2 elementary age boys that my husband and I are co-homeschooling. We chose not to go the virtual route. We are actually doing the curriculum ourselves, which in some ways is really fun and in some ways is really not. So, and then doing all the regular everyday stuff. I mean, in here in California, we've had more restrictions than most. I also have been pretty good at putting up boundaries. I know you and I kind of talked off air, but like trying to put up boundaries between what is work and what is home, because I actually never leave my house.
Right.
What's work, what's home, what's mom life, what am I doing? And I'm also a writer, and that's really important to me too. So I spend, several hours a week, like writing, if nothing else other than journaling, just because this time is weird and I mean, also exciting, and doing something that I love professionally, and momming during this season, and all the stuff the military brings to it. I mean, currently my husband's on shore duty, so we have not dealt with the like weird deployment thing during COVID, but
wow, that's awesome.
It's all come with its own set of weird challenges. So every day looks very much the same and also very different based on kind of what's going on. Like I work inside my house, so I very rarely ever leave. And also, one day homeschooling is really hard for my kids and they're laid out on the floor. And the other, another day, like they get right to it and we have fun. And I think, man, I could do this forever. 24 hours later, I'm like, why did we ever make this decision? This is horrible. Like, what were we thinking? So I think in this season, especially, there's been a lot of high highs and a lot of low lows. And for me, trying to balance the best I can, all of the roles that I fill and all the roles that I play, and try to combat kind of that. I heard a great phrase like fatigue. I think in this season, that's probably been something that I have worked on as far as my own mental health, is that like just being tired of how everything is.
Yeah.
And so tried to, get outside more and exercise more and, do fun stuff with my kids to keep everybody busy, because very tired of being home.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I'm excited for you to go on vacation soon. And also why I feel revitalized, because we talked about this offline, but even, last week was the first time in months where my husband and I just took off to the mountains and we literally had no reception. We found out when we arrived that we were going to have no reception or Wi-Fi. And it was really a blessing in disguise. So, before we go, Jenny Lynne, I just want to take a minute and, not just say thank you for your service, but applaud you for everything that you've done. And also I appreciate everything that you shared. And I'm very happy for you that you have found a career that is very fulfilling. And also just thank you for sharing your story and for contributing to the show, because, like we talked about so often already in this conversation, these stories feel so normal to us, but maybe to the new spouse or the new family, or, just the civilian counterparts I keep bringing up, like they have no idea. They have no idea that our service members have a family, that they want to come home to. They're not just like robots that came out of the ship or jumped out of the, the plane and started fighting. Like there's more to that than what the movies and what media have romanticized around the military. And so again, it's just so great to have a platform to really unpack all of that and destigmatize that and let people know that we're just as human as everyone else.
I think I just want to reiterate how grateful I am to be a part of this. Like, I am so glad that newsletter came to my inbox. This is like the most fun, like weird thing I never saw coming, but I'm really, really I love podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time. Never thought I'd be on one, on a recurring basis. So for me, this is super fun. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to you and I both come at this military role slightly differently, you having grown up in it and then marrying a veteran, and me, currently doing the active duty thing. I think it's super important that we both have a different perspective of this lifestyle and yet inherently understand one another. And so I'm just really grateful to be here.
Yeah.
This is fun.
Oh, good. I'm so glad you're having fun. I feel, the way that you worded that, I feel like we covered all our bases. We have the child perspective, we have the active duty perspective, and then we have the veteran sort of perspective when I talk about my husband, because we actually met after his service. So it's interesting to see the impacts of what the military had done to him after the fact, and also just how he continues to have this passion for our military community. Otherwise, this show probably wouldn't have existed if he wasn't still a diehard military advocate after his service. Well, awesome. Jenny Lynne, it's an absolute pleasure having you. I'm so glad that you're having fun on here. I'm excited to have more fun with you. And I know that our upcoming guests are really going to appreciate having you on and your perspective as well. And that's it. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, Jenny Lynne. Thank you for being on. And thank you again for sharing your story. And I'm very much looking forward to these upcoming interviews with you.
Me too.
Cool. All right. Well, I will officially wrap it up now. So to our listeners, we hope that today's episode gave you one more piece of knowledge, resource, or relevant story so that you can continue to make confident and informed decisions for you and your family. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll chat with you in the next episode. Tune in next time.